market movers. This is The Pulse with Francine Lacqua.
Well, good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, in a moment, we'll discuss market sentiment with Kamakshya Trivedi, head of global FX and interest rates at Goldman Sachs. But first, Geneva is at the center of global diplomacy, where the U.S. is actually holding indirect talks with Iran and brokering the next round of discussions between Russia and Ukraine. So let's speak to Mark Champion, Bloomberg opinion columnist, and Hugo Miller, Bloomberg's Geneva correspondent. So thank you to all three of you for joining us. Mark, first of all, I mean, this comes on the back of the Munich Security Conference. Again, quite a lot of anticipation about that Marco Rubio interview and the speech, which doesn't seem to be that friendly towards Europe. What did we find out at Munich that we can transpose into Geneva?
Well, I think the Munich basically told us that, U.S. policy hasn't changed since a year ago. Rubio is a little more polite, but the essence of U.S. policy that he laid out are exactly the same. The approach to Europe is exactly the same. It's quite hostile. And that really translates through Ukraine, which he barely mentioned. What we see now is the next round of talks. The Russians, since the last round, which seemed to be quite pragmatic, the Russians have been really doubling down, insisting that there is this spirit of Anchorage, this deal that we don't know about that was made, they say, in Anchorage when Putin met Trump. And that deal was very favorable to the Russians, and it set out basically it gave them what they want. So they have now sent a team to Geneva. That team is headed again by the sort of amateur historian who's the culture minister, instead of by the more detailed-oriented people. Last time that he was there, he just talked history. Yeah. So it's a kind of, at the same time, from the other side, you have Trump saying Zelensky's better make a deal, come to the table, or he's going to be in trouble. So, it really is sort of, Europe excluded and Ukraine under pressure. And I think that's where we are, and it's not very favorable for the Ukrainians.
Mark, I want to go to Hugo in just a second, but how unusual. I mean, these are two very, very different portfolios when you're dealing with Iran and Ukraine. So why is it in the same day, in the same place?
I don't know. I can't tell you. But, what is the case is that the two men who are conducting these negotiations for the U.S., Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner, they are, in charge of both portfolios, and they're both there. So it'd be kind of like speed dating for them, where they're kind of moving between these two, sets of negotiations. So exactly why they decided to do it that way, if it's logistics, if it's a message of some kind, or if they just think that they can handle it, I really can't say.
Hugo, what can you tell us about what we can expect in Ukraine? We saw the speech from, of course, Vladimir Zelensky over the weekend in Munich Security Conference. I thought it was a great speech. It didn't get much traction. And so I don't know what you think happens on the ground today.
Good morning, Francine. Yes, speed dating, Mark. Interesting way of putting it. I think one thing that is interesting is this is not happening at the U.S. mission in any way. Last November, there were talks held there, and it was very much a U.S. show. This is being held on a slightly more neutral ground at the Intercontinental Hotel, where traditionally talks do take place. It's very hard to get a sense of what the Ukrainians expect to get out of it. There is obviously a large difference in where the two stand on terms of the issues of territory. The Ukrainians may brief journalists this afternoon. I think if they do, perhaps it's because they feel that they've got a little bit more momentum, or things are perhaps going better than the rather gloomy scenario that Mark just laid out for the Ukrainians. But we won't know until this afternoon if they are indeed going to say more, and what they will say, very much remains to be seen.
Kamakshya, how's this playing out on the markets? As head of emerging markets, again, I don't know whether this has a direct impact, or actually markets for the moment would rather just forget about geopolitics because they don't know how to price it and they don't know how to expect.
Yeah, I think the really interesting thing, Francine, is the tension you're seeing on the one hand between these geopolitical risks, the valuation-driven, some of the sell-offs in the AI space, but actually really strong cyclical data on the other hand. And a lot of emerging market assets are, at the end of the day, cyclical assets. And so what you're really seeing is, so far, because markets are struggling to price those geopolitical risks, you're not really seeing that geopolitical risk premium outside of certain pockets like gold, for example, or the Swiss franc, where these talks are taking place. The rest of the emerging market complex, or really the rest of the cyclical asset market complex, I think is still pricing off that better cyclical data that you're seeing across the world.
Are they right not to price anything for oil?
I think you're tending to see this thing where, oil prices are holding up, I think, where they are, and even going up into weekends before kind of relaxing on Mondays when, you don't get some kinetic action. I think so you're seeing a little bit of that premium there. And again, that's another thing where if you get any kind of positive resolution out of any of these things, I think there's actually a downside skew to oil prices, which again would be quite helpful to the broader risk backdrop and again to emerging market assets.
Mark, what do you think will happen with Iran? We understand from Iranian officials that, again, they're willing to discuss their nuclear enrichment activities, but have tied it to U.S. sanctions. And then there's always this rumor that a U.S. strike could come.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Donald Trump appears to believe that he can get the Iranians to accept, to move out of their comfort zone and accept something simply to avoid, getting hit by, two aircraft carrier strike groups. We'll see. There is this sort of debate going on within Iran, within the regime, with sort of hardliners saying, look, this is an existential fight. We can't really afford to make a deal. We have to just make our stand. Otherwise, as the Islamic Republic, it will kind of undermine us and we won't be able to get there. The more kind of pragmatic side, which includes the foreign minister who's in the talks, they're sort of arguing that we need to make some kind of deal. We need to get some economic relief. We've got these major protests. We need something.
But, Mark, I mean, is this very binary, that you either have a stalemate which could push President Trump to, conduct or support airstrikes, or you have progress which would avert strikes?
It looks like President Trump doesn't really want to pull the trigger, that I'm just speculating there, just from the things that he's said. That's the sort of message that he's kind of giving out. You had Benjamin Netanyahu worried enough that he went to Washington to try and, hold Trump to the sticking place and say, it's got to be nuclear plus ballistic missiles plus an end to supportive proxies, which is the kind of deal that the Iranians absolutely won't make. Trump is kind of holding his cards a little close to his chest, and we'll find out. If it's just a nuclear deal, that's quite possible. Once it moves out into ballistic missiles and proxies, that becomes, much harder to envisage.
Hugo, how are you expecting actually the negotiations on Ukraine going? We understand that the Russian president is definitely trying to play for time. His negotiators trying to drag out these peace talks. So the economy is being slammed at home and they're suffering massive casualties. But at the same time, they're hoping to pound Ukraine further, I guess.
Yes, I mean, I was reading a good piece today just about how much Putin is, using the winter weather, and I think as long as the cold weather remains, Russia is has no interest really in doing anything other than playing for time. As Mark mentioned, Vladimir Medinsky is much less of a details-oriented guy. He's much more of a kind of just champion of this greater Russia dogma that Putin has been pounding for years. Kirill Dmitriev, who's led the Russian delegation in other talks, I think is much more detail-oriented. So if you look at essentially the two sides that are coming together, it seems to perhaps be one that is going to be more just playing for time, certainly on the Russian side. And in a way, the Iran talks, from what I've was hearing from an analyst, may be much more conclusive, be much more substantive. And 2 days from now, the situation, for better or for worse, may have evolved much more than with the Ukraine-Russia standoff.
Kamakshya, I mean, again, I don't know whether you cover Russia any longer as an economy, but it does seem that a lot depends on China and whether China feels strong enough. I mean, I had a NATO ambassador to, a U.S. NATO ambassador, the U.S. NATO ambassador to NATO, who was basically saying with one call, China could stop this if they call Russia. What's the Chinese, economy's thinking right now when it comes to some of the geopolitics?
I mean, look, I think on the economy, I would say China is, at one level in a very strong place. I think, growth has been, was stronger than consensus expectations. We think it's going to continue to be firm. It is a very bifurcated economy, so you have kind of a very, very strong external sector and a very weak domestic, part of the economy. And I think the implication of that from a global market standpoint is also the extent to which you're seeing this play out in the currency markets, in the strength of the CNY. It's kind of one of our strongest conviction views that the CNY will continue to appreciate. So I think that is going to happen. I think in the extent to which they can exercise leverage more broadly, I think is still an open question.
Yeah, what influence, Mark, do you think China's having at the moment? There's also a link between Iran and Russia.
Well, absolutely. So on the Ukraine front, the Chinese are extremely influential in the sense that they are sustaining Russia's ability to, produce drones and missiles and so on, in the face of sanctions. And so they are extremely important. They're very quiet about it, but it is, it is central. And it's true that if the Chinese were to lean on Putin, then it would change the complexion of the war greatly. But that's highly unlikely, I think. And then on the Iran-Russia side, it's been interesting that that's a dog that sort of hasn't barked. That, Iran did make this, there was this kind of axis of anti-Western forces, anti-US forces, with forming with Russia and Iran, China, North Korea, and so on. But when push really came to shove, and the Iranians needed really significant help, air defenses and all that sort of thing, the Russians really couldn't supply because they're too engaged in Ukraine, and the Chinese, for whatever reason, didn't.
All right, thank you all for a terrific way to get us started this Tuesday morning. Mark Champion, Bloomberg opinion columnist, Hugo Miller, Bloomberg Legal Europe reporter in Geneva, and Kamakshya Trivedi is staying to discuss the Fed and the UK after the break. So coming up, UK unemployment has reached its highest level since the pandemic, setting the stage for a possible interest rate cut this spring. We'll have more on that next, and this is Bloomberg.
February 24th, as affordability, immigration, and national security dominate the headlines leading into the midterms, President Trump will deliver his State of the Union address. Balance of Power will bring you live global coverage starting at 8 p.m. Eastern.
The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is The Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, conflicting U.S. economic data, falling inflation but strong hiring has made the path for future interest rates cuts unclear. That means a lot is riding on this week's inflation data and the minutes from the last FOMC meeting. Well, Kamakshya Trivedi, Chief FX and Emerging Market Strategist at Goldman Sachs, is here. Kamakshya, thank you so much for sticking around. We talked about geopolitics before. Look, there's just quite a lot of markets' expectations for interest rate cuts. It all depends on inflation. We had a benign print, but does it stay that way?
Yeah, I think it does stay that way. I think if I look back at our outlook for this year, I think we do have a stronger growth outlook. The strong jobs data that you mentioned is very consistent with that. I think the really differentiating feature of our view on the U.S. is that despite that stronger growth outlook, we actually expect inflation to remain benign. So the numbers we got, very consistent with that. And we think there's some cyclical reasons, the waning impact of the tariffs, this, softer wage growth. growth, but also some structural reasons, whether it has to do with, some of the AI impacts, whether it has to do the deflation coming out of China that is being exported to the rest of the world, particularly in goods inflation. Both of those should keep inflation under control. So we're very comfortable with that, combination of slightly stronger growth, benign inflation. That should be pretty supportive for risk assets, and it should be moderately, cause the dollar to moderately weaken further, even after the depreciation that we've seen.
What can you tell us in terms of, some of the things that people have said is actually, tariffs will somehow get into the second half of figures in the U.S. Has that been already, been miscounted, or is it already priced in?
I think some of it has already been reflected. Some more will be reflected. But again, this is a kind of, unless you see sort of fresh developments there, they should sort of gradually come out of the, the upside impact that it's imparting on inflation. And so, again, I think that that's a kind of one-off impact, and it should gradually come out. And I think that's not going to be something that keeps inflation higher for longer, which is, again, one of the reasons, we're very comfortable with, we have 2 cuts in our forecast for the Fed. Second half of the year. Yeah. That seems to be, the right place to be. The markets have swung back and forth. They were pricing less earlier. Now they're pricing a bit more. I think that's still the right modal view to have.
And what's happening to the labor market?
Yeah, we think the labor market is, still generally on a kind of softer trend, but the recent data has been quite encouraging. It's certainly not something that you're seeing like a, big slowdown that would kind of concern you so far. But it's been on a kind of softer trend for some time. I think combined with some of the stronger GDP data, the pickup in sort of industrial sector activity there, I think the cyclical data still looks good. And it goes back to what I was saying. I think there is this tension that I think we're going to have to live with for most of this year between, on the one hand, somewhat challenging valuations, lots of uncertainty in the AI space, the geopolitical risks that we were just discussing, but a really strong support from the cyclical side and from the macro combination of cyclical data being strong, inflation being benign, and that being quite a supportive thing for cyclical assets overall.
At what point, I don't know if you're expecting further dollar weakness, and is there a point where actually it starts hurting them?
We are expecting further dollar weakness. I think that, the dollar is still an overvalued asset on our metrics, and I think that high valuation was supported by kind of exceptional macro and market performance in the U.S. for many years. We think we are getting less exceptional macro and market performance from the U.S., and I think the dollar should depreciate further. I don't really think the rate at which it's depreciating and the fact that it's coming from an overvalued level should make it a big concern for policy authorities in the U.S. After all, it's a large economy. Trade is a relatively small share of GDP. So it doesn't have those kinds of impacts that kind of, small open economies need to be particularly concerned about. So, yes, more dollar depreciation ahead.
OK, let's also talk about the UK. A rate cut by the Bank of England could be on the cards after the latest UK unemployment data. For more, let's talk to Kit Rees, Bloomberg's Markets Today editor. Kit, so good to have you on the program. So what is the BOE likely to make of the data?
So things are likely trending in the right direction, really, for the Bank of England. So today we saw wage growth cool more than expected, and unemployment was elevated as expected too. But, I want to say that there's still a lot of uncertainty. The last vote was very, very close. So it shows just how divided members of the Monetary Policy Committee are. And looking at the data itself, things like payrolls are very prone to revisions. So it's hard to get a very clean read on this. Plus, the ONS itself throws in lots of caveats into the data, saying that certain time periods can be a bit volatile. So it's hard to kind of get this broader read. But overall, the markets are fully pricing 2 rate cuts by the end of the year. Again, not exactly sure when these are going to come, so there's a bit of uncertainty there. But overall, it looks like things are trending in the right direction. And with tomorrow's inflation data, hopefully we might get even more confirmation that inflation is coming down whilst the jobs market is cooling.
Kit, the unemployment rate, again, is at the highest since the pandemic. So that's another thing for an already unpopular UK Prime Minister.
Yeah, definitely. Away from the economics, it's also a political issue. And, one thing that was really striking was the high level of youth unemployment in the figures. So obviously for voters, this is going to be a very salient issue. And some of the things that have added to this situation are the tax increases that were introduced last year. We have higher energy costs for businesses. The hike in minimum wage has also made it more expensive to hire people. So overall, businesses are still struggling. It's still a very weak backdrop, which isn't going to escape, voters, politicians, also, Bank of England members. So we've got a couple of risk events on the horizon, local elections, the spring budget. So we'll be definitely keeping an eye on the pound and gilts and how they perform going forward. But it's still very uncertain and sort of murky waters ahead.
Yeah, I have to say that jobless rate amongst 18 to 24-year-olds is 14%. So that, is a huge number as young people bear the brunt of the hiring slowdown. Kit, thank you, as always. Our Bloomberg Markets Today editor, Kit Rees. Well, we're back with Kamakshya Trivedi. Kamakshya, when you look at sterling, first, the Bank of England is a very different, when you look at the level of interest rates, it's the gap between the ECB and the BOE. I don't know if that's justified. I think would be my first questions. And how do you expect the BOE to behave from here?
We expect more rate cuts from the Bank of England. In fact, we think there's going to be 3 more cuts the rest of the year. That's more than market pricing, like you were just discussing. I think that, for purely, I would say, plain macro vanilla reasons, the fact that the labor market is soft, that inflation is coming down, I think that gap between, the ECB rate and the Bank of England rate is going to compress, and that's going to drive, sterling weaker versus the euro in particular. I think that's one of our key views. The sterling also, bear in mind, had a very good few years, so it's sort of pretty highly valued as a currency. So again, it's not it's not undervalued anymore as an exchange rate. I think some weakness is likely, some weakness is warranted, some weakness should be, I think welcomed by U.S. policymakers from current levels.
The Prime Minister is going through such a tough time. Is that playing out in the markets? Could it play out in the markets?
I would say less so this year than it has been I would say through much of 2025, in the sense that I think political risk premia, both in gilts and in sterling, was a big driver, I would say, for most of last year. When we look at our metrics, in some sense, you had a little bit of a pickup of that in January around the sort of political developments there. But, my view for, actually gilts to outperform and for sterling to underperform is much more, I think, based just on the macro reasons. It's pretty straightforward. You don't need to invoke the politics. This is a country where the labor market is soft, where wage growth is coming down. Inflation is finally catching down. It's been a laggard to a lot of the other G10 developments. We'd expect that to happen this year. And that should allow the Bank of England to cut, and to cut more and more forcefully than many other G10 central banks. That should keep sterling on a weaker path. That should allow gilts to start doing a bit better. That's a pretty macro, case.
Talk to me about yen. This was the big surprise with the landslide victory last week. But this is what happens to yen from now?
Look, I think that, the yen reacted in a kind of fairly positive way, along with all Japanese assets, in response to this kind of landslide victory. And, that momentum could continue a little bit longer. But I think the key here is, what is the stance of the Bank of Japan? Whether they are really willing to kind of step up the pace of the hiking cycle, to support that yen strength. We're not convinced that it's going to be that much faster. We're expecting the next hike to come in July. It could be a little bit earlier than that. I don't think it's going to be March. But, overall, the pace of that hiking cycle is still a pretty moderate one. Mm-hmm. And if you see, still some of the, wage growth metrics, they're picking up, but they're not really sort of, blowing things out of the water yet. I still think that it's been a little bit too far, too fast in terms of the yen appreciation. Our forecasts are centered around 155 for dollar yen. I think that's still around the right sort of level. I think the combination of the kind of intervention threat, and alongside some of the other measures and the kind of buy Japan enthusiasm has settled both, I think, the yen and the long end of the rate curve. Yeah. But I think the yen should gradually move weaker again. So interesting.
Kamakshya, thank you so much for being with us. Kamakshya Trivedi there, Chief FX and Emerging Market Strategist at Goldman Sachs. Coming up, the French President Emmanuel Macron will meet India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi as the two countries deepen ties. We'll have the details next, and this is Bloomberg. Good morning, everyone, and welcome to The Pulse. I'm Francine Lacqua here in London, and these are your top stories. Geneva takes center stage for U.S. foreign policy with crunch talks on both Iran's nuclear program and Russia's war in Ukraine. UK unemployment reaches its highest since the pandemic as the labour market continues to weaken, setting up a potential rate cut by the spring. Plus, the French President Emmanuel Macron is making his fourth visit to India. He'll try to persuade the Prime Minister Narendra Modi to upgrade his air force with French fighter jets. So the French President Emmanuel Macron is on a 3-day visit to India to advance talks on a massive defence deal for more than 100 Rafale fighter jets. He'll meet India's Prime Minister Narendra Modi and attend an AI summit as the two countries deepen ties. Now, for more, we're joined by our government reporter, Sudhi Ranjan Sen. Sudhi, thank you for joining us. So what can we actually expect from the Modi-Macron meeting?
Well, from the Modi-Macron meeting today evening, in fact, in a couple of hours from now, we're going to see a wide-ranging multilateral announcements coming in, and primarily among them, the focus would be on defense, joint manufacturing, co-production between the two countries. There's going to be space, and also there is going to be cooperation in critical technologies like AI, for which there is a summit that's happening, but a bilateral cooperation between the two countries that is going to figure very prominently. In addition, there is going to be discussions on mobility of talented workers from India. India has been trying to create opportunities for its people. So broadly, these are the key areas where we're going to see discussions and announcements coming out.
So why is the meeting so important, and what is actually expected from the meeting of defense ministers?
Well, I mean, as we've reported, India has decided to go for the French-made fighter jets. Now, it's a multi-billion-dollar deal. It's the biggest defense deal ever for India in the last 7 decades. So that is the main talking point. However, there are some more steps, processes to be completed before it can, a contract can be signed. What's important about it is that France and India are coming to an agreement whereby there is going to be transfer of technology. There is going to be, the two countries getting together to manufacture. And what we have reported and are being told by government officials in India is that large number of these jets, of the 114 that India is planning to buy, are going to be made in India. That's going to be a big boost for Modi, a big boost for the defense manufacturing in this country. Overall, if you look, the significance is that India is widening and broadening its cooperation. While it's moving away from Russia, it's also not sticking only to the United States. And the two countries are trying to, look for certainty when the global order is going through huge challenges.
But, Sandy, I mean, Modi is also showcasing the country's tech industry at the summit. So, there are challenges, but also this is a reason to celebrate.
There is a reason to celebrate, but and India is trying to get into the space of AI governance. Look at the space where AI is going to impact. Try to generate the discussion on having AI for the sectoral AI, so to say, where it's actually going to help or harm people. And in that, India and countries like France, Brazil, and the other countries like Switzerland, Spain, they've all come in with the hope that while they have perhaps lost out in the bigger race of artificial intelligence, these countries could make themselves relevant in the discussion and the discourse in this area.
Okay, so interesting. Sudhi, thank you so much. Sudhi Ranjan Sender, Bloomberg's India government reporter. Now, Geneva is at the center of geopolitical discussions today as two sets of peace talks get underway. It comes as the U.S. Secretary of State Marco Rubio attempted to reassure European leaders at the Munich Security Conference at the weekend after the damage inflicted on transatlantic ties over Trump's Greenland threats. Well, with us now is Evie Aspinall, director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Evie, thank you so much for joining us. When you listen to what Marco Rubio was saying, it felt friendlier in tone, but not necessarily in substance. How should we take it?
Exactly that. I think there was kind of a conscious effort, and even as a person, I think there is a kind of a tendency among Rubio to be a bit more diplomatic when it comes to Europe than Vance was. And so there is a clear sense that there is some degree of willingness to be constructive. But underneath that, I mean, Europe has been absolutely destroyed, actually, by the kind of the state of relationships in the last kind of few months, and are very, very nervous about the future of the relationship with America. So whilst this goes some way to being like, oh, actually it's not so bad, and maybe we'll do this with you, actually underneath it there's still lots of messaging about the importance of Europe rearming, and even comments about how the US would do it alone if it had to. And I think that will have sent some alarm bells ringing.
So what I don't really get to grips with, Evie, is that is Europe doing enough? Are they trying to do enough to get their act together so that they can stand alone in terms of defence?
Europe is definitely scaling up, and it's scaling up pretty rapidly. But a lot of it is noise. You know, so a lot of these commitments are being made to appease Donald Trump. They say, oh, no, we're going to increase defence spending to 3%, 3.5%, because it looks good. But the practicalities of doing that, when it comes to defence procurement, defence capabilities, a lot of Europe doesn't have that. There's a broader question as well, which is lots of European countries are having difficult economic situations at the moment, and trying to build public support to increase defence spending at this moment in time is very, very difficult.
So how would you describe this transatlantic relations? You know, for me, it was also very telling that Marco Rubio yesterday, after the Munich Security Conference, went straight to Hungary, offering his support and pledge to Viktor Orban.
Yeah, and I think that in itself says a lot about the reality of where the Trump administration is, where it aligns itself with people in Europe. You know, Hungary is a notorious agitator within Europe, but within the EU particularly, and so there is a lot of discomfort with that decision, even though it's perhaps not too surprising. It's where a lot of Trump's politics lie. But I think it speaks to the ideological differences that are at the heart of the rupture we're seeing between the US and Europe.
So what do you think that Europe does next if these US security commitments become less and less predictable?
I think Europe is trying very hard to work out how it can prioritise its own defence without the US, how it can reduce some of its reliances. That is incredibly difficult, not least because there are very impressive US defence companies that are incredibly powerful, and actually a lot of Europe is very reliant on. So it's a very difficult thing for Europe to do, and they are very reliant on the US, but they're going to be conscious efforts to move away.
I mean, what does success in Ukraine look like? Because, you know, if you succeed in Ukraine, that kind of keeps Europe together.
Exactly, and I think that's one of the biggest challenges at the moment is that Europe isn't in the conversations around Ukraine and the ongoing negotiations, and so its voice isn't really being heard. It's critical for Europe that Ukraine's sovereignty is protected, that territory isn't lost, that it's able to come closer to NATO, to Europe, and that's looking quite unlikely, particularly with the stance Trump is taking to negotiations.
But I mean, a reminder that actually there's not much, there haven't been arms or money coming from the US for quite many months.
Yes, exactly, and so Europe has stepped up, actually, to some degree for Ukraine, but it's not sustainable. Long term, Ukraine cannot last and it cannot survive without US support, and so these negotiations are critical for Ukraine's future.
So should Europe get closer to China for either protection or certainly influence over Russia?
I think you'll definitely see Europe will move closer to China, and in large part that's we're in a world that is more multi-aligned, and it is becoming increasingly acceptable to work with lots of powers at once, and so we are seeing Europe moving closer to China. There are benefits to that, primarily economic, but there are also risks, and the security risks of closer collaboration with China are very real, and I think a lot of Europe is aware of them, but at this moment in the time, because they're so nervous about the United States, they're being pushed towards China out of necessity rather than choice.
So, again, are the next couple of months crucial, or does Europe have a little bit more time, given all the conflicting messages from the US and, frankly, also from China?
I think it really depends, in part because of what Trump does. If he'd asked, a month ago when there was a Greenland crisis, everyone would say, Europe must act now, it's all very, very urgent, and we need immediate independence. That's not realistic and it's not viable. At the same time, it's kind of calmed down a little bit, but it always feels like we're about one tweet away or one comment away, and suddenly everything will spiral again. So I think Europe is trying to move very quickly, but it's not got the capabilities yet to do so.
What do you worry about the most right now when it comes to geopolitics? And actually, we also have a very weakened UK Prime Minister, and so I don't know what that means and how that's reflected in negotiations.
Yeah, I think for Europe and across Europe, Ukraine is the top priority. It's been going on a long time. A lot of attention has been drawn away from Ukraine in recent years because of lots of other challenges and crises. But that is kind of in many ways the symbol of European security, and failure to support Ukraine would ultimately splinter Europe and its security long term. And I think you're right. The UK has a challenge because, post-Brexit particularly, its position on the world stage has been weakened. We have a leader that's got domestic challenges that it's trying to fight, and he's done a very good job, actually, on the international stage, and that's been quite well respected. In particular, working as a bridge between the US and Europe. That bridge position is increasingly difficult, though, because relations are splintering so quickly.
I mean, are you expecting US foreign policy to change as we get closer to the midterms?
I think so. I think there is a potential that it either escalates or it calms down, whichever he feels is the most politically palatable at the time. I would like to hope that it'll calm things down a little bit, you'll focus domestically, and the international side will be a little bit calmer and more constructive, not least because actually many Americans are supportive of a relationship with Europe and want to make sure that those alliances stay strong.
I mean, there's one question on actually Macron of France is also so weakened. We were just, hearing how he's in India trying to sell some of the Rafale fighter jets. But is Germany and actually Chancellor Merz the new kingmaker in Europe?
So Germany's definitely stepping up. I would say Germany has a challenge that culturally it's very anti-defence and has been for a long time, and it's had to kind of in the last, particularly post the invasion of Ukraine, shift towards a more defence-led mindset. That isn't natural for Germany, and actually when you see the next German elections, I think that will come out again. So in some ways Germany is stepping up, but I think you will always see Germany, France, the UK, and increasingly Poland kind of leading within Europe on defence.
And where's China in all of this? They've been quite quiet.
Yeah, they have been quite quiet. I think they're kind of letting things play out, and at the same time having got one-on-one conversations. We obviously had Starmer was in China recently. Lots of European leaders are going over to China, making deals, focusing on growth, and kind of winning over friends and allies slowly and surely as the kind of chaos happens over to the other side.
Well said. Evie, thank you so much. Evie Aspinall, they're director of the British Foreign Policy Group. Now, India is hosting one of the world's largest artificial intelligence summits, with the Prime Minister Narendra Modi seeking to clear a path for India in a heated race to develop frontier models. World leaders and tech giants, along with investors, are meeting in New Delhi. Let's bring in Bloomberg Opinions columnist Catherine Thorbeck. Catherine, thank you for joining us. So there are some big names attending the summit. What does India hope to achieve from this?
That's right. So it's really a who's who of Silicon Valley descending here on Delhi this week. We have Sam Altman from OpenAI, Sundar Pichai from Google, Dario Amodei from Anthropic. And at the same time, Indian companies are really commanding the spotlight, too. We had news earlier today that the Adani Group is investing $100 billion to produce data centers and really position India as sort of an AI hub. And, in some ways, I think the summit is a bit of a sort of PR spectacle for Modi. But at the same time, I think it's really giving India an opportunity, and really the global South, to really have a seat at the table in this AI conversation. So much is focused on the US-China AI race, but middle powers don't want to be left behind. And I think that just the amount of excitement for AI and for tech in India this week is just tremendous. And you can really feel it in the air and really in the traffic here in Delhi this week.
So on the other side, what does the tech and AI industry hope to get from India from the summit?
Right. So India has really emerged as one of the biggest users of generative AI. It has an incredibly huge and tech-savvy young population. It has the second highest user base of any country behind the U.S. Of ChatGPT. So it's really become this sort of must-win market for big tech companies. And they're really, investing billions and pulling out all the stops to really win over and lure Indian users to their AI tools and services and platforms. So I think this competition for India has really become sort of a really, like I said, must-win market for these Silicon Valley companies. And I think just that user base and tapping into that young and tech-savvy population has become very, very important.
In a wider view, can Southeast Asian countries beat the West and also China in this global AI race, or are they really lagging behind?
Right. So I think it will be very difficult for India and for other countries to compete on foundation models and on building sort of these big frontier models. You really need deep pockets, and that's a very difficult task. And there's already some sort of clear winners. But at the same time, I think that there's really an opportunity for India to make a big difference when it comes to building AI products and, AI sort of applications. And I think that another, sort of secret weapon that India has is really its people. As I mentioned, it has this huge user base of AI, but it also has a huge developer base. So I think that there's definitely a lot of potential and a lot of excitement for India to sort of keep pace in this AI race, and especially when it comes to making sort of products and applications.
I mean, Catherine, do they have to choose between China and the U.S.? And is China really only like 6 months behind? I mean, 6 months feels like you could catch up pretty quickly.
Right. So I think that they're trying to sort of position themselves as sort of a third way and show that sort of a third way is possible that doesn't have to sort of align with China or the U.S. And at the same time, like I said earlier, you know, U.S. big tech companies, Silicon Valley, are really vying very hard for this Indian market. And I think that, you know, there is a China sort of delegation here as well. So we'll have to sort of see how it all plays out. But I think it's definitely something to watch here in Delhi this week.
Catherine, thank you so much. A Bloomberg opinion columnist, Catherine Thorbecke. Now, coming up, AI fears send Dassault and Siemens stock down this morning. We'll have the latest tech and market development next. And this is Bloomberg.
Earnings season is here.
Let's get back to the earnings story.
Get all the details that you're going to need to start the trade.
Bloomberg is first to break the numbers.
A bunch of earnings, pretty agricole.
Earnings from Heineken, ABN AMRO reporting as well.
Fantastic reporting from you and the team.
With the smartest insights.
We've delivered again record results.
If we take a step back and look at the yearly results, the income is stable.
Our earnings interviews continue. Lots of really contrasting conversations.
Continuing coverage on Bloomberg.
The conversations that matter, the insights you need. This is the Pulse, and I'm Francine Lacqua here in London. Now, AI continues to cause market disruption. Dassault Systemes and Siemens are the latest to be hit by investor concerns. Let's bring in Bloomberg senior market strategist Neil Campling. Neil, thank you so much for joining us. So what does the appetite for AI investment tell us? I mean, it remains high despite the disruption hitting other equity valuations.
Yeah, absolutely. There's a big conference going on in AI in India right now. Everyone who's someone in AI is there. And we're getting talk about Moonshoot looking to raise $500 million on a $10 billion valuation. Quite remarkably, that's double the valuation just a month ago when they last raised money.
Yeah, so this is a Chinese AI company.
Chinese AI company, and today there's a lot of focus on Chinese AI. We had Alibaba come up with the latest update of their AI toolset, and we're expected any minute, any day to have DeepSeek as well come out. So in public markets, we are having this kind of this two-way pull about the disruption of the AI is causing, and that's very much on a vertical layer by specific apps. But on the horizontal layer, these big language models with these big data sets, there's still a lot of investment that's wanted in this space.
Yeah, I feel like we're, and it's this race, especially between the U.S. and China, but also within the U.S., it's different, companies trying to get there first or trying to have a better product. But when does it settle? Because you could have this fight like 6 months in, 6 months out, I'm more advanced, I get used more, and then it changes in 2-3 years from now.
Like it does with every technology evolution, as we've seen. Sometimes the early mover advantage doesn't necessarily pan out. But I think the key that we have to remember on this particular example is the real value is in the data and who owns that data. Now, one of the things that Alphabet has is it owns the data. Right. Microsoft doesn't own the data. It's mainly through their OpenAI JV. No. So in that partnership model, it's about who owns the data. And that's what I think is going to play out during this year, as to find out who the likely winners are, for sure.
Neil, talks between Anthropic and the U.S. government over the uses of their AI systems. What does it tell us about safeguards?
Absolutely, and guess what? It comes again down to data and who owns the data, and will data be used in a wide range to get data on US citizens. And so safeguards are important, and like with any technology, we need to have processes in place to make sure that they are used safely and do not get used by bad actors, which obviously is always a risk. And so we have to have these guardrails in place.
Neil, thank you so much for joining us. And Neil Campling there, Bloomberg's senior market strategist. Now, Hyatt Hotels executive chairman Tom Pritzker is retiring from his position and will not stand for re-election to the company's board. This, they said, citing an association with Jeffrey Epstein. Now, Pritzker says he deeply regrets his association with Epstein and Ghislaine Maxwell and decided to quit the role he's held since 2004 after discussions with fellow board members. And President Trump says he's speaking with his Chinese counterpart Xi Jinping about weapons sales to Taiwan. While speaking aboard Air Force One, Trump said he would make a decision soon. China has previously warned that the U.S. to handle arms sales to Taipei with the utmost cautions.
President Xi, in your talk with him recently, warned about sending more weapons to Taiwan. What was your response to him? Are you going to send more weapons to Taiwan?
I have a response. I'm talking to him about it. We had a good conversation, and we'll make a determination pretty soon.
And Bloomberg has learned that SpaceX and xAI are competing in a secretive new Pentagon contest to produce voice-controlled autonomous drone swarming technology. Sources say Elon Musk's companies are among only a few selected to compete in the $100 million prize challenge. While SpaceX is an established defense contractor, AI-enabled weapons development marks a new and potentially controversial move for Musk. Now, Russia is trying to leverage its old soft power ties in Africa in the absence of significant economic hard power, with the continent being a target for Russia since the Soviet Union supported decolonization during the Cold War. Well, that's a story in today's Bloomberg Big Take by Anthony Squazin. Anthony, thank you for joining us. So talk us through, first of all, what Russia is doing, first of all.
Thank you. As you mentioned, Russia doesn't have a huge amount of money to spend and hasn't got much to offer in the way of trade to Africa, but it does want to build its influence. So what it has turned to is soft power, and one of the most obvious examples of that is the way that it has rapidly expanded the presence of the Russian Orthodox Church across the African continent, signing up priests, getting new adherents, and those churches and priests often echo Vladimir Putin and the Russian government's talking points about Western decadence, the impacts of colonialism on Africa and how Russia's their friend, and conservatism and family values, which appeals to a lot of Africans.
So, Anthony, what's been the reaction on the ground?
Well, it's been quite. It's been done in quite a stealthy way, so it hasn't been noticed by a lot of governments. The expansion began in early 2022, and they've moved from 3 countries into 34 countries across Africa. But what is happening now is that there are a lot of other things coming up about Russia's involvement in Africa. Recruitment of Africans to fight in the war against Ukraine, recruitment of young women to work in drone factories. And there's beginning to be a realization that by pulling too close to Russia, African countries are also letting themselves in for a relationship that could be quite difficult for them, especially when they have to explain to their populations why they've let their people go and fight in a foreign war they know very little about.
Anthony, can religion replace the economic and political moves by other countries seeking influence in Africa?
I don't think so. I think China, the US, Europe will always have more heft because they can spend a lot of money, on infrastructure, funding power plants, building roads, investing, their companies doing business in Africa. Russia doesn't really have that to offer, but it doesn't have anything else, and it's doing its best with the tools it has. And this is one of the ways it has decided to do its best to build up its influence. And alongside that, they've also opened a lot of cultural and language centers. And that's the strategy it's following. Whether it's successful, we'll have to see.
Anthony, where's China in all of this?
Well, China hasn't got anything to do with particular strategy, but China is dominant in Africa. It's by far the biggest trade partner. It's built in a huge amount of Africa's infrastructure, roads in Nairobi, dams in Cameroon. So it's very well known, and its soft power and contribution towards the African continent is recognized by your ordinary citizens. But it isn't working hand in hand with Russia on this particular case.
Anthony, thank you so much for the great reporting, but also what we've seen, of course, for the big take. Anthony Squazin, Bloomberg's senior reporter for Africa. Now, this is a picture across the board. Again, stocks seem to be fluctuating a little bit. Contracts on the NASDAQ 100, for example, suggesting a slide in technology shares that may have further to run as Wall Street investors return from a holiday break. Now, the outlook for the Fed rate cuts also in focus following Friday's inflation data. Investors seeking clues on the Fed's rate path from Michael Barr and San Francisco Fed President Mary Daly, and you can see S&P futures down 0.1%. Now, Jesse Jackson, one of the most prominent U.S. civil rights leaders of the 20th century, has died. He was 84 years old. In a statement, Jackson's family said he died peacefully, surrounded by family.